Let me begin with a question that most commentators are too polite to ask out loud. Why hasn't this war already ended in a way that looks like victory for one side or the other? 2.5 years in, and we are still watching a conflict that refuses to resolve itself along any of the lines that either Moscow or the capitals of Europe originally imagined. I want to spend the next half hour walking through why that is, because I think the answer tells us far more about the psychology of power than it does about tanks, drones, or gas lines. Start with Moscow. It has become fashionable in certain circles to talk about the Russians, as though the Kremlin and the Russian public are one and the same organism, thinking with one mind. They are not. If you actually talk to people who have been inside the country recently, what you hear is frustration, not with the man at the top personally, but with the pace of things. Ordinary Russians do not understand why their army, which by every account now numbers over 1 million trained and equipped men, has not already pushed further west. They ask why Lviv is untouched. They ask why Odessa, why the river lines, why Kiev itself remain outside Russian control after all this time. That frustration is real, and it is worth sitting with, because it tells you something the propaganda on both sides tends to obscure. This is not a population clamoring for peace. It is a population clamoring for decisiveness. So why the caution at the top? I'd point to 3 things, and none of them require conspiracy theories to explain. First, there has always been a genuine fear in the Kremlin of triggering direct intervention from the West, not necessarily the United States, but Western Europe specifically. A land war that stays confined to Ukraine is, from Moscow's perspective, a manageable problem. A land war that pulls in even a fraction of NATO's European members becomes something else entirely, something with no obvious ceiling. Restraint in this light isn't weakness, it's arithmetic. Second, building an army capable of doing more than holding ground takes time. It is one thing to occupy territory and grind down an opposing force in static, attritional fighting. It is another thing entirely to conduct large-scale offensive operations with the kind of force density that avoids catastrophic losses. That buildup has apparently taken the better part of 2 years, and by most accounts it is now essentially complete. The force in question is larger, better trained, and better supplied than anything Russia fielded in the war's opening phase. Third, and this one gets less attention than it deserves, there has been a deliberate effort to keep the Russian domestic economy insulated from the worst effects of the war. That insulation has been reasonably successful for a long stretch, but it is fraying. Strikes on missile production facilities and on refineries, along with a rising number of Russian civilian casualties from long-range attacks, have started to erode the sense that the war is something happening over there. When the war starts showing up in the form of damaged infrastructure and dead civilians inside Russia's own borders, the political calculus around restraint starts to shift. Which brings us to the reports of fuel shortages and long lines at gas stations in occupied Crimea. I'd treat those reports with real skepticism. Fistfights at a gas station are not evidence of societal collapse. They happen anywhere fuel gets scarce for an afternoon, including plenty of places far from any war zone. What's more interesting is who is amplifying these stories and why. There is a chorus of commentators, historians, and retired generals in the Western press who have been predicting Russian collapse on a roughly semi-annual basis since this war began. Each time, the predicted collapse fails to materialize, and each time, a new round of the same prediction gets recycled with fresh packaging. That doesn't mean Russia has no problems. It means the Russia is crumbling narrative has a track record worth remembering before you buy the next installment of it. Now let's talk about the question that actually matters most here. Does Moscow fear a wider war with NATO? I think the honest answer is yes, it fears it, even though on the cold arithmetic of military capability, it probably shouldn't. And this is the part of the story that deserves far more scrutiny than it usually gets. Look at what's actually being said in European capitals right now. Calls for rearmament, talk of drafting military-age men, promises to rebuild arms industries that have atrophied since the end of the Cold War. All of it aimed, rhetorically at least, at deterring or confronting Russia. But look at the substance behind the rhetoric. The active militaries of Britain, France, and Germany combined would not fill out what earlier generations would have called a single, robust army group. They lack the logistics tail to sustain themselves far from home soil. They lack, in most cases, the industrial base to replace equipment losses at any meaningful rate. This is not the Wehrmacht of 1940 or the Red Army of 1944. It is, in blunt terms, a set of boutique forces dressed up in the language of continental deterrence. But here's the danger. It doesn't matter whether the threat is real if the target audience believes it is. And Russians, who, unlike many Western audiences, get to hear these European statements largely unfiltered, are absorbing a steady diet of language that sounds, to them, uncomfortably close to 1941. That is about the worst possible message you could send a country whose entire modern historical memory is organized around surviving existential invasion. Provoke that memory carelessly, and you don't get caution in response. You get mobilization. You get belligerence. And unlike the boutique forces currently making the threats, Russia actually has the reserves, the factories, and the equipment to back up a mobilization at scale. Take Germany's recent legislative push on reservist call-ups as a case study. The stated target is a force of roughly 260,000 active troops and 200,000 reservists by the year 2035, 9 years out. If you strip away the political theater, what you're left with is a government making a long-horizon commitment that virtually guarantees none of the officials proposing it will still be in office to see it through, in a country where any serious attempt at conscription today would likely trigger mass public resistance. Picture the demonstrations, hundreds of thousands of people in the streets of major cities, signs reading some version of, "We are not fighting in Ukraine, we are not fighting in Russia." That is not a hypothetical. That is the default expectation given current public sentiment in Germany and most of Western Europe. So what you actually have is a government issuing threats it cannot currently back on a timeline that outlives its own political survival, which would be almost comic if it weren't feeding a genuine and genuinely dangerous sense of encirclement in Moscow. And that sense of encirclement interacts badly with a separate problem, the Kremlin's own domestic messaging. For years, it has been convenient for Russian state media to frame this war as a continuation of a decades-old confrontation with a resurgent, hostile West, a framing that borrows heavily from the memory of 1941. That framing served a purpose when it kept the public rallied behind a limited military campaign, but it becomes a liability the moment ordinary soldiers start repeating it back as literal fact, coming off the front line and telling interviewers they believe a full-scale war with Europe is coming. There is no such war coming, realistically. Anyone who has spent real time in European capitals recently knows this. There is no public appetite anywhere in Western Europe for a war with Russia. None. But a population that has been told repeatedly that this is 1941 again will eventually start acting like it's 1941 again, regardless of what the underlying facts actually support. That is how a manageable regional conflict tips into something much harder to walk back. Let me pull the lens out for a moment and put this in historical context, because I think it clarifies why Vladimir Putin conducts himself the way he does. The formality, the staging, the deliberate, almost theatrical control over every public appearance. This is a leader who situates himself consciously in a line of continuity running from the Tsarist state through the Soviet period to the present. Russian political culture has, historically, expected its leaders to project total command, visibly, ceremonially, without the loose, improvisational style that some Western leaders have made into a kind of populist brand. When Putin speaks in that formal, produced register, he is not indulging vanity. He is performing the role the Russian public expects the man at the apex of the state to perform. And he has centuries of invasion memory to draw on. The Mongol period, the Polish occupation of Moscow in the 17th century, the War of 1812, 1941, a long historical record that gives every appeal to national survival an immediate, visceral resonance with the domestic audience, whether or not the specific threat being described is proportionate to that history. That is precisely why loose talk from European officials about drafts, rearmament, and confrontation is so reckless. It is being received in Moscow not as posturing, but as confirmation of a historical pattern the population has been primed for centuries to recognize and respond to. If the man at the top ever stands up and says the decision has been made, mobilization is underway, war is at hand, that will not be received as bluster. It will be received as fact, and it will be acted on as fact. Everyone involved in shaping the Western side of this rhetoric should be thinking harder about that dynamic than they currently appear to be. Now, on the question of direct retaliation, strikes against the manufacturing base in Western Europe that supplies weapons to Ukraine. It's worth being clear-eyed about the fact that these facilities are not secret. Their locations are broadly known, discussed openly in the European press, understood by everyone involved. The restraint shown so far hasn't been a matter of capability or knowledge. It has been a matter of threshold, a judgment, apparently made at the highest level, that the strikes and provocations absorbed so far, including a reported attempt on a Russian leader's own residence, haven't yet crossed a line that would justify a broader counterstrike using the full range of available systems. But that threshold is being tested continuously, and by most accounts, the internal question being asked in Moscow right now isn't whether the capability exists. It clearly does, including systems the West currently has no reliable means of intercepting, but how much more damage and how many more casualties need to accumulate before restraint stops being the operative policy. Let's talk about the American role in all this, because there's a fiction that gets repeated constantly and deserves to be retired. The idea that the United States is a neutral party or a disinterested mediator in this conflict. It is neither. By any reasonable definition, the United States has functioned as a co-belligerent, supplying intelligence, supplying weapons systems, and shaping Ukrainian military planning in ways that go well beyond the role of an outside observer. For a long stretch, there was a genuine hope in Moscow that a change in the American presidency might translate into a genuine effort to resolve the underlying dispute. There was real investment in the idea that a particular high-profile summit represented a sincere opening. In hindsight, from the Russian side at least, that summit increasingly looks like theater, a moment staged for domestic political benefit rather than a genuine step toward resolution. Whatever understandings were reached there don't appear to have translated into anything durable. And yet, and this is a detail that gets lost in most coverage, American popularity inside Russia remains, by most accounts, surprisingly resilient. Ordinary Russians tend to locate the source of their grievances in Europe far more than in Washington. There's even a persistent, somewhat curious belief in parts of Russian society that Russians and Americans share more in common culturally than either does with Europeans, an idea that doesn't hold up especially well under scrutiny, but that nonetheless shapes public sentiment in a way that has, so far, worked in Washington's favor. Whether the current administration in Washington appreciates the value of that goodwill or is inclined to spend it carelessly is a separate and more troubling question. Let's shift now to the other theater that's impossible to separate from this discussion, the Middle East, and specifically the fragile arrangement currently governing the relationship with Iran. Whatever paper understanding currently exists between Washington and Tehran, it's worth remembering who actually drafted it. It was largely an Iranian proposal, accepted by Washington primarily as a way to pause hostilities, take pressure off global energy markets, and buy time. Read the substance of that understanding closely, and you find provisions, regarding Lebanon for instance, that are already being violated in practice. Reports from the last day alone describe Israeli forces conducting strikes inside Lebanese territory, including against civilian vehicles, along with the bulldozing of roads, the leveling of villages, and the establishment of what look like permanent checkpoints. That is not the behavior of a party planning to withdraw. That is the behavior of a party settling in. Which raises the obvious question: does anyone seriously believe this pause represents an actual end to hostilities? I don't think it does. And I don't think anyone with a realistic view of the region thinks so either. What we're watching is a pause, dressed up in the language of resolution, useful for domestic political messaging, useful for stabilizing energy prices in the short term, but not a genuine settlement of the underlying dispute. Layer onto that a deeper structural shift that I think is still underappreciated. The United States is not going back into the Gulf in the way it once was. The old basing infrastructure there isn't coming back. What's emerging instead is a conversation about basing American forces in Israel itself. A proposal that, if it moves forward, effectively locks the United States into permanent regional exposure. Because as long as American forces are stationed on Israeli soil, the entire American presence in the region will be read locally as inseparable from Israeli objectives. That is not a formula for ending this conflict. It's a formula for extending it indefinitely, with American forces as a fixed target inside it. And the regional picture backing this up is stark. Turkey and Iran, historically rivals as much as partners, are increasingly aligned in opposition to Israeli regional ambitions. Gulf states that depend on stability for their own survival are quietly hedging, rebuilding financial and diplomatic channels with Tehran rather than waiting on promises from Washington that haven't been kept in full. Iran, whatever one thinks of its government, has positioned itself as the one regional actor that directly confronted Israeli and American power and is still standing, a fact that carries enormous weight across the broader Islamic world, regardless of how any of us in the West choose to interpret it. Meanwhile, there is open talk in Israeli political circles about an eventual confrontation with Turkey as well, talk that ought to be treated as extraordinarily dangerous rather than dismissed as bluster. Because escalatory rhetoric in this region has a habit of eventually finding its own justification. The uncomfortable truth underneath all of this, in both theaters, is the same. Restraint is running low, on multiple sides, in multiple places, at the same time. In Ukraine, restraint depends on a Russian leadership that is being pushed by its own public and by continued strikes on its territory toward a threshold it has so far avoided crossing. In Europe, restraint depends on governments making promises they cannot keep on timelines that outlast their own relevance, while feeding a narrative of existential threat that their own populations don't actually believe and have no intention of fighting for. In the Middle East, restraint depends on a pause that already shows every sign of being temporary, propped up by an understanding that one side appears to be violating in real time. None of this is destiny. Wars that look inevitable in retrospect were rarely inevitable in the moment. They were the accumulated result of small decisions made by people who each believed they were managing risk rather than creating it. That's worth remembering here. The rhetoric coming out of several European capitals right now is not cost-free, even if the underlying military capability behind it is thin. Words that sound like posturing to the people saying them can land as confirmation of existential threat to the people hearing them, and history gives us no shortage of examples of how that mismatch ends. If there's a single thread running through everything we've covered, the caution in Moscow, the overreach in European capitals, the fragile pause in the Middle East, it's this. The people making the loudest declarations right now are, almost without exception, the people least equipped to follow through on them. And the people with the most actual capacity for escalation are the ones being provoked into using it. That is not a stable equilibrium. It is a set of conditions that tends, historically, to resolve itself in ways nobody intended and few people wanted. The wiser course, on every side of this, would be de-escalation dressed as strength rather than escalation dressed as resolve. Whether anyone currently in a position to choose that course actually will remains, at this point, an open question, and probably the most important one on the table.